So welcome, and thank you all for coming. And welcome especially for the 3 people who came from the UK, except one of them decided to go to New York today. Michael Dwyer, Rachel Dwyer, and Faisal Devji. But also Shahzad, who just joined us from, there he is, from Stanford. And immediately agreed to be a commentator for Faisal's paper. The idea for this one day coming to terms with the sacred asked really the question as to could the suggestion of existence of the sacred spaces within popular culture really constitute an insoluble challenge or not? Or does the idea offer a novel possibility, which is what we are here for exploration of an inevitable coexistence whose critical examination promises to advance our understanding of life, religion, culture in both India and Pakistan? Are there lessons we can learn today from these ongoing discussions and discourses, which we will do, come to it at the end of this one day on the roundtable discussion. So this mini conference was the culmination of a series of discussion by about 4 people, concerned scholars on this campus and beyond that. We began to explore the themes of the sacred or its absence. In fact, it was really the theme of the absence of some issues about religion that brought us here today, through the medium of film, text, poetry, political discourses. This one-day conference was conceptualized both as a starting point and a contribution to the kind of cross-disciplinary discussions that really are needed in many campuses, especially in this day and age. It was the work of people like Wazira, Zaminder, Anani, Faisal, Rachel, my husband Akosh Ostor, though not part of this institution, but by implication he is too, have engaged and which have been incorporated in our courses to the, on issues of the sacred or its absence. Having a panel discussion also alongside these 2 presentations by Faisal and Rachel, I thought it would be a great idea to have 4 students who've just returned from the field to talk about their experiences and to see if it dovetails some of the issues that we will be discussing. All of them have encountered notions and ideas or practices of discrimination, and so that's how we drew these 4. And it was not like they were just randomly selected. This was a very, very carefully selected 4 graduate students. I would say the best of the best. And of course, they are Wazira students and mine. What do you expect? So this conference owes huge thanks to many, many people who helped us come up with it. Co-sponsorship primarily from the COGAT, who ran this whole thing. Institute. Thank you to Amanda Anderson. But also people like anthropology, religious studies, Africana studies, student life, contemporary studies for the study of South Asian, Highmark, and least or not, and not the least of which we owe a thanks to both Kit Salisbury and Traude. A huge thanks for the work that they did in setting this disparate part and bringing it together. And it seems so natural that it just everything fell in place. So thank you all for coming, and I'll give a hearty welcome to all of you, but Faisal and Shahzad will be our first 2 presenters. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Lina and Amanda from the Kogat Center, Shahzad for being discussant. It's a great pleasure to be here again. And in some ways, I'm here under false pretenses because I don't have as much to say about popular culture, except beginning with it. I want to begin with a cliche that has indeed become part of popular culture in many Muslim societies. And this cliche has to do with the idea that in Islam, whatever that is, there is no division between church and state. Now, when you look underneath that stereotype, you see there actually is a kind of form of thinking, however vapid it might have become in the meantime. And it's a form of thinking, a critical form of thinking about liberalism. Because when you say that there's no distinction between church and state in Islam, let's leave the in Islam bit aside for the moment, because that is indeed, I think, the most suspect bit of the sentence. The denial of the distinction between church and state, of course, is a critique of an equally cliched idea of liberalism as being built upon a distinction of spheres between church and state or public and private. And you can see why someone might mount this critique by saying, how can you bifurcate individuals and groups of people between public and private? What are the connections that actually bind these two spheres together, connections that might be sundered legally and constitutionally? Does this kind of division not, in fact, end up reducing the religion that is confined to the private into a mere form of ineffectual, personal and even narcissistic spiritualism, and leave the non-religion that is supposedly part of the public sphere to dominate the whole of society with its violent instrumentalities? But what I want to do today then is to go precisely behind the cliche that holds that there is no distinction between church and state and Islam, a cliche that actually ends up depoliticizing the category called Islam, rather than, as we have been told for decades now, repoliticizing it. So we often think that modern Islam is a politicized form of religion precisely because its votaries say things like that there is no distinction between church and state in Islam. I actually want to argue that the opposite is true, that by making this claim, modern Muslim thinkers are in fact depoliticizing Islam. They are not giving any autonomy or integrity to the political as a site of freedom. And much of the problematic thinking and even more problematic actions that come out of this way of thinking, I think, result from precisely this depoliticization. We can talk about that later. What I want to do today is speak about how a very important modern Muslim thinker, the poet and philosopher, Indian poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who flourished, was active from around 1908 to 1938, actually thought about the church-state distinction. And I want to show that far from rejecting the autonomy of politics, he is in fact trying to establish it, but not in a liberal way, not by a separation of spheres, not by a church-state distinction. So how do you do that? One way in which Iqbal wants to, as it were, rescue politics as a site of freedom, just as philosophy is a site of intellectual freedom, was not by a separation of spheres, but by the esoteric, by thinking esoterically, by thinking about what is secret, what is hidden, what is non-manifest. And this is a traditional way of thinking which is familiar, which continued to be familiar to Iqbal and his generation, in the way in which people read poetry, for instance, which was always read in this manner by different levels of interpretation, right? And in doing so, Iqbal comes really closest to someone like Leo Strauss, his contemporary in Europe, who also, and I think uniquely, privileges the esoteric dimension of intellectual and indeed political life. With Strauss too, you have a kind of deep suspicion of these liberal separations. So what does the esoteric mean here? So with that, let me begin reading, and I hope I won't take as much as 45 minutes in doing so. Iqbal traced the liberal separation of church and state into private and public spheres to Christianity, noting that the monastic institutions of the medieval church and its conception of religion as otherworldliness already implied such a partition. But it was only with the Reformation that this separation was formalized, leading to the ethical as much as political breakup of Europe. Rather than being a functional separation, therefore, Iqbal thought that the division of church and state was itself a metaphysical and Christian one between the material and the spiritual, a division that was itself perhaps an inheritance of what he called Magian dualism. And he writes, in Europe, Christianity was understood to be a purely monastic order which gradually developed into a vast church organization, not against any system of polity of a secular nature, for the obvious reason that there was no such polity associated with Christianity. And Luther was perfectly justified in rising in revolt against this organization, though I think he did not realize that in the peculiar conditions which obtained in Europe, his revolt would eventually mean the complete displacement of the universal ethics of Jesus by the growth of a plurality of national and hence narrower systems of ethics. So basically he's doing a genealogy of the church-state distinction, right? And he's tracing it to medieval Christianity, rightly or wrongly. If you begin, he continues, with the conception of religion as complete otherworldliness, then what has happened to Christianity in Europe is perfectly natural. The universal ethics of Jesus is displaced by national systems of ethics and polity. The conclusion to which Europe is consequently driven is that religion is a private affair of the individual and has nothing to do with what is called man's temporal life. Islam does not bifurcate the unity of man into an irreconcilable duality of spirit and matter. So notice what he's saying. He's tracing the church-state division to a metaphysical distinction between the spiritual and the material. Right? It is metaphysical, indeed one might say, theological. Now, because it operated as a fundamentally metaphysical distinction, the separation of church and state, and subsequently of public and private as the sites where church and state belonged, was not simply Christian, if not Magian, in a cultural or particular sense, but universalized in the form of capitalism. For as the realm of the material, the state or public arena became the site of a purely instrumental commerce as well as politics, whose most important vehicle came to be the nation-state, conceived as both the instantiation of materiality in the form of a people's collective property, that's how you see the state, and as the juridical guarantor of the individual's right to ownership. For Iqbal, then, the nation-state was made possible by prying open a metaphysical distinction within Christianity of spiritual and material, from which it emerged as the vehicle of a violent materiality over which the universal ethics of Jesus had little control, confined it as it had been to private life. So once you do that, you create the material sphere and therefore the public arena as a site of, in his view, violent instrumentality, because the universal ethics of Jesus has been confined to personal and private life. And he writes, Europe uncritically accepted the duality of spirit and matter, probably from Manichaean thought. Her best thinkers are realizing this initial mistake today, but her statesmen are indirectly forcing the world to accept it as an unquestionable dogma. It is then this mistaken separation of spiritual and temporal which has largely influenced European religious and political thought and has resulted practically in the total exclusion of Christianity from the life of European states. So here is a Muslim thinker who regrets the decline of Christianity from the public life of Europe. The result is a set of mutually ill-adjusted states dominated by interests not human but national. And these mutually ill-adjusted states, after trampling over the morals and convictions of Christianity, are today feeling the need of a federated Europe, i.e. the need of a unity which Christian church organization originally gave them, but which, instead of reconstructing it in the light of Christ's vision of human brotherhood, they considered it fit to destroy under the inspiration of Luther. So more than Christianity, it's a specifically Catholic vision that Iqbal is referring to. But for Iqbal, the problem of property, a subsidiary form of the material as a metaphysical category, went well beyond either public or private ownership. Property was also entrenched epistemologically in discursive thinking, which operated by separating its subject from an object to be known and therefore exploited as a thing. Addressing the problem posed by property then required far more than the equally materialist and in fact impossible task of abolishing it. So he says if you divide the world into public and private, the material and the spiritual, what happens to the public and the material is that it gets to be conceived of, especially after the Reformation, in terms of property, right? And one version of the dominance of property comes with the establishment of the nation state, itself seen as property writ large, the property of its people. It's our state. It's no longer a dynastic state, all right? But more than this, property comes to reside even in forms of discursive thinking, when you think in terms of subject and object, where you need to operate on something external. That too is a materiality, right, in Iqbal's view. So it's an epistemological as much as political problem that is being raised here by shunting out the spiritual or the ideal, or what Iqbal eventually calls conviction, ideal, and spirit. Crucial instead was the adoption of a non-materialist or spiritually defined politics as well as everyday practice of life, and the eventual abandonment of discursive thinking altogether. This is his ambition. This was, of course, a tall order and called for a primarily ethical transformation, one that Iqbal thought possible in colonized countries like India, where property hadn't yet been so generalized as to define all social relations there. So he says, the interesting thing about India is that her very backwardness in this respect makes certain things possible, precisely because property does not define social relations. People do not interact with each other on the basis of either discursive thinking or claims to property of various kinds. So he points out that, for instance, the crucial categories of European politics, class and race, which are both material, as it were, are not so evident in India, where instead it's caste and religion that are the operative categories. And caste and religion have their own sets of violences built into them, but they're actually not entirely materialistic or materialized. They are linked up to cosmologies of various kinds. They work epistemologically, intellectually, as much as they do in any other way. They cannot simply be defined as class and race are by what is given outside, either what you look like or what you are biologically, or what your role is in the relations of production. Right? They are internal. Like his contemporary Gandhi, in other words, Iqbal saw the ideal or spiritual as possessing a force in India's impoverished, hierarchical, and religious society that it no longer had in Europe. And while this notion no doubt owed something to the stereotype of a spiritual East, Indian thinkers like Gandhi and Iqbal made it into something quite distinctive, both intellectually and politically. The contradictions of Indian society then, which is to say its curious mixture of asceticism, sacrifice, greed, and violence, offered in Iqbal's view a demonstration of the fact that property had not yet been so generalized as to define human relations there. This was especially true of the interest that characterized liberal states, which defined identities as version of private or collective property, whose interactions were to be regulated by commercial as much as political forms of contract. So interest is a basic political category in liberalism. And to be an interest is actually to think in terms of property. What pertains to me, what belongs to me, what have I right to, etc. All right. And interests, of course, can only relate in contractual terms. Contract not simply as a social contract, but always already as a commercial contract, a contract about property. Referring to these contradictions in his presidential address to the annual session of the All India Muslim Conference in 1932, Iqbal noted, "These phenomena, however, are merely premonitions of a coming storm which is likely to sweep over the whole of India and the rest of Asia. This is the inevitable outcome of a wholly political civilization which has looked upon man as a thing to be exploited and not as a personality to be developed and enlarged by purely cultural forces. The peoples of Asia are bound to rise against the acquisitive economy which the West has developed and imposed on the nations of the East." All right? So he thinks India's backwardness offers a possibility for rethinking, let's say in this case, liberalism. One of the ways in which India stood as an illustration of Asia as an alternative to European history was in the fact that its political units were defined not by the materialistic factors of class or race, so much as by ideal or ethical and intellectual ones named by caste and religion. As was true of religious disputes in India, such an idea-based politics was by no means devoid of violence, but for Iqbal it was nevertheless a more hopeful and productive one, whose disintegration in the face of colonial liberalism had only exacerbated communal conflict there. While Iqbal joined a number of his companions, compatriots, Hindu as well as Muslim, in pointing to India's very backwardness, as I've suggested, as a sign of her inability to be assimilated into capitalism's modernity, however, he couldn't simply rely upon this to guarantee the country's freedom, or indeed that of Islam with which he thought it was linked. In his address to the Muslim League in 1930, Iqbal noted that India was important for Islam not only because it possessed the world's largest Muslim population, but also due to the fact that its social and religious diversity meant the country could be seen as Asia, if not the world, in miniature. To resolve the problem of political coexistence in India, therefore, would be to provide a model for the world at large. But this proved to be a promise difficult to fulfill, and Iqbal eventually settled for a kind of internal redistribution of the country into a federation of Hindu and Muslim-dominated states. Crucial about this unsatisfying compromise was that it was meant not simply to secure the material interests of India's Muslims, but instead to afford them the autonomy to modernize Islam by divesting it of what he called its inheritance of Arabian imperialism. Similar to so when he's asking for this kind of rearrangement of India, the chief Islamic reason he poses is in order to transform Islam itself. Similar to his compromise on India's future, Iqbal's view of Muslim politics elsewhere ended up dominated by the vision of an alternative international order that he sometimes called an Eastern League of Nations, in which the nation state he so disliked was circumscribed but not extinguished. Given his failure to imagine or realistically propose a truly alternative politics, Iqbal resolved instead to set the stage intellectually for a yet unknown future, and this is where the critique of liberalism comes in. So I've just tried to point out that, he has a politics, obviously, it's fairly compromised and unsatisfying, and I've tried to lay it out a bit here, and now I want to proceed to the way he intellectually takes on the problem, he had posed, which is to describe how people outside Christian Europe came to think differently about the relationship of politics and theology in a way that didn't reduce it to one between the spiritual and the material. So he does intellectually what he cannot do politically. The liberal state's division into public and private then represented not only a metaphysical distinction between the material and the spiritual realms, but fundamentally also a spatial rather than temporal one. It's always conceived of in terms of space. Instead of being taken together as part of a continuum in the way both modern physics and Persian philosophy did, in his view, Iqbal thought that liberalism had made time into an independent principle of the spiritual world in private life. And against this, he sought to contrast the temporal axis that he thought defined the relationship of politics and theology in Islam. So he's saying, here's liberalism, it's based on a fundamentally spatial ideal. That doesn't take time much into consideration. I want to look at how, in Islamic terms, it's time that is the axis on which the relationship of politics and theology is mapped, or mapped is too spatial a term, occurs. All right? Interestingly, for a self-proclaimed Sunni thinker, Iqbal always preferred the Shia doctrine of imamat, or hereditary religious leadership, as his chief example of Islam's temporal rather than spatial distinction between politics and theology. So in a 1911 article in the Hindustan Review on political thought in Islam, he described the occultation of the 12th Imam in the following way. So in Shiism, you have a series of leaders, most of whom are not actually there, all right? And the last one is meant to have disappeared and is a messianic figure. And Iqbal says, whether the Imam really disappeared or not, I do not know. But it is obvious that the dogma is a clever way of separating the church and state. The absent Imam is absolute authority in all matters. The present executive authorities are therefore only guardians of the estate, which really belongs to the Imam, who as such inherits the property of deceased intestates in case they leave no heirs. It will therefore be seen that the authority of the Shah of Persia is limited by the authority of the mullahs, the representatives of the absent Imam. As a mere guardian of the estate, he, i.e. the Shah, is subject to the religious authority, though as the chief executive authority, he is free to adopt any measure for the good of the estate. It is not therefore surprising that the mullahs took an active part in the recent constitutional reforms in Persia. So while he seemed to be pleased in this article with the active participation of the Shia clergy in the 1906 constitutional revolution of Iran, By the time he came to write the Reconstruction, Iqbal called dangerous the separation of powers in the country's constitution that gave the religious class a supervisory role in legislation. What interested him was not the mutual limitation that religious and political authorities exercised against each other in such an arrangement. This is, after all, what is described. This is Persia, this is Shiism, this is how the role of the political and the religious authorities occurs, right? So what he's interested in is the fact that it was a temporal deferral of the Imam's reign that made politics possible in a necessarily imperfect and so secular world. In other words, precisely because the Imam hasn't yet come, you cannot instantiate religious perfection. You cannot instantiate a religious society before the Messiah arrives. You know, there are strong parallels in Jewish thought, right? And therefore, it is this realm of imperfection, this time of imperfection, that is simultaneously the time of freedom. That's where politics becomes possible, right? On a temporal model and not a spatial one. In this sense, the monarch's virtue acted as a kind of catechon, restraining the coming of God's rule on earth. Unlike in its Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christian usage, which Carl Schmitt introduced to modern thought, for Iqbal, this restraining function was meant to defer not the coming of the Antichrist, but very explicitly divine justice itself. So he's saying, you know, it's great, the Imam isn't here, God's rule can never be instantiated because it's forever being deferred, and this is the realm of freedom. In an open letter to Jawaharlal Nehru on the Ahmadis, a group which we can talk about later, he identified the Shia theory of politics with a deferral of the theological world as such, and in describing the distinction upon which it was based as functional rather than a metaphysical world, one also assimilating it to Sunni ideas of the state. And he says, nor is the idea of a separation of church and state alien to Islam. The doctrine of the major occultation of the Imam in a sense affected this separation long ago in Shia Iran. The Islamic idea of the state must not be confounded with the European idea of the separation of church and state. The former is only a division of functions, as is clear from the gradual creation in the Muslim state of the office of Shaykhul Islam and ministers. The latter is based on the metaphysical dualism of spirit and matter. So he returns to this. Public-private distinction, church-state distinction is metaphysical, it's based on spirit and matter. This distinction, which he reads as Islamic, is functional, and it has a metaphysical dimension, of course, because it's about the vanished Imam. But in a way, that metaphysical distinction allows for what you can call a secular or profane realm of freedom. But Iqbal didn't leave the Sunni theory of state here, and though he wrote a great deal more about such functional details and separations in the theory of the caliphate, which he was happy to conceive of as a democratic assembly in modern times, his most important and also most controversial contribution had to do with the idea of prophetic finality, that Muhammad is the last prophet. If the temporality of Shia political theory then was premised upon the deferral of the imamate into an indefinite future, therefore allowing the present to be a site of imperfection and so freedom, for Sunnis who repudiated the imamate's apostolic succession, it was founded on the ending of divine revelation with Muhammad in the past. The Shia view is, as it were, future-oriented, and the Sunni view is past-oriented. So in the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, which is a series of lectures Iqbal gave in the mid-1930s, Iqbal describes the Prophet as putting an end to divine intervention in the world and so leaving it free for humanity's political, philosophical, and other activities. It's a quite distinct vision of Islam, as you will see. He says, the Prophet of Islam seems to stand between the ancient and the modern world. Insofar as the source of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the ancient world. It's relegated to the past. Insofar as the spirit of his revelation is concerned, he belongs to the modern world. In Islam, prophecy reaches its perfection in discovering the need of its own abolition. This involves the keen perception that life cannot forever be kept in leading strings, that in order to achieve full self-consciousness, man must finally be thrown back on his own resources. So he reads Islam as the end of occult intervention into human history. Right? The Prophet abolishes himself and creates freedom. And in creating freedom, He literally makes possible human agency in history for the first time. So having argued that humanity had emerged as an historical actor for the first time with the coming of Islam, Iqbal was faced with the possibility of a newly emancipated mankind either destroying the religion that gave it birth or being annihilated by it. The possibility of man's freedom, therefore, was what paradoxically forced Iqbal to adopt a highly conservative position with regard to the very Islam whose transformation he was always recommending. So he's put himself in this paradox. He's really, in a way, proclaimed the death of God, right? And created a space for human freedom, or a time of human freedom. And then he suddenly thinks, oh my God, what's going to happen to religion and religious authority? How are we to deal with this? It's the very radicalism of the gesture that leads to the conservative response in his own person. And it was in this situation that esotericism, as with Strauss, became crucial as a way of protecting politics and theology from each other. Because Strauss thought that, the thing about religion and politics is that they were mutually destructive if they were placed in too direct a relationship with each other. It wasn't that just one took the other over, but they mutually, did violence to each other. So how do you actually make for a relationship that avoids this kind of destructive and violent consequence? And for Strauss, it's a kind of esoteric philosophy that is crucial, and so it is for Iqbal. Now remember, for Strauss, he's getting his esotericism from Islamic and Judeo-Islamic thought. So Farabi and Maimonides primarily, whom he introduces into the canon of Western European thought. He's the first person to do that, to break that canon, right? And for Iqbal, it's much more familiar because it's already been inherited, this Islamic, and it's popular and commonplace in literature especially. And Iqbal is a poet, so in a way he's using the resources of literature to think about this political and theological issue. But to think of esotericism in merely instrumental terms as a deliberate lie would be a mistake, since before the invention of modern politics as an autonomous practice separated from ethics, it was literally unthinkable as a category in its own right and could only constitute what in the more old-fashioned reaches of European political thought was called an arcanum, right? What arcane, all right? By Iqbal's day, of course, such a notion of politics was already a faded one, but esotericism continued to exist non-instrumentally in poetry, where otherwise audacious and even heretical statements could still be made, but also denied, by the aesthetic use of stock themes and levels of interpretation. The interesting thing is that people were entirely familiar with this world of esotericism, but unable from the modern period to think about it outside the literary. And in a way, what Iqbal is doing is trying to open that up again. And the literary had to be his base. That's interesting in its own right. Not the Quran, not the Sharia, not political thought, literature. Which is why he writes poetry as well. Iqbal himself made routine use of such an esoteric writing as a poet, and it is remarkable how much he managed to get away with in so doing, especially in his frequent challenges to God and glorification of man as being nothing less than divine in his freedom from God. Esotericism functioned as a kind of open secret whose role was to separate theology from politics and philosophy as the sites of intellectual and practical freedom, not in any spatial way, but rather by a process of differential interpretation. And this meant that crucial to Iqbal's political vision was not any institutional arrangement so much as the free individual whose interpretation determined the character of any act. So whereas most modern Muslim thinking goes into building institutions or imagining them, or we need a structure of law and we need this and we need that, Iqbal, though he writes about them, is actually much more interested in the making of individuals who can perform this task of interpretation, of esoteric thinking. And he says, in Islam, the spiritual and the temporal are not two distinct domains, and the nature of an act, however secular in its import, is determined by the attitude of mind with which the agent does it. It is the invisible mental background of the act which ultimately determines its character. An act is temporal or profane if it is done in a spirit of detachment from the infinite complexity of life behind it. It is spiritual if it is inspired by that complexity. In Islam, it is the same reality which appears as the church looked at from one point of view and the state from another. It is not true to say that the church and the state are two sides or facets of the same thing. Islam is a single unanalyzable reality which is one or the other as your point of view varies. It's the individual who determines. The point is extremely far-reaching, and a full elucidation of it will involve us in a highly philosophical discussion. Suffice it to say that this ancient mistake arose out of the bifurcation of the unity of man into two distinct and separate realities, which somehow have a point of contact, but which are in essence opposed to each other. So, going back to the liberal distinction, but in another work, which I discuss in the full paper, he actually does a longer history where he talks about Greek dualism versus Persian dualism. Right? Now, despite holding decided opinions about the modern history of politics and theology in Islam, therefore, Islam's true concern, Iqbal's true concern, was with the fostering of free individuals, and he seldom gave much weight to merely institutional projects. So he simultaneously supported and criticized Muslim liberalism as much as tradition. Indeed, he was suspicious of the attention Muslim thinkers continued paying to the preservation of their religion's social organization, approving though he was of it in many respects, writing that, quote, their leading idea was social order, and there is no doubt that they were partly right, because organization does, to a certain extent, counteract the forces of decay. But they did not see, and our modern ulama do not see, that the ultimate fate of a people does not depend so much on organization as on the worth and power of individual men. The only effective power, therefore, that counteracts the forces of decay in a people is the rearing of self-concentrated individuals. As clear a statement as you would like. Right? Such an attitude, however, compels us to recognize that Iqbal wasn't really a political thinker at all, but instead one more interested in laying the conceptual foundation for human freedom in Islamic terms by lending it an alternative history. And if the individual was so important for him, this was not simply because esotericism depended upon the interpretative action of such a figure, but also due to the fact that man's freedom was meant both to complement and even replace God's own. For the death of God entailed by prophetic finality had to lead inexorably to the divinity of man if it was not to end in the complete vitiation of theology as such. So bizarrely, to preserve the theological means to divinize man, and to displace God. Iqbal's poetry is all about this. Man is constantly competing with God. He's constantly a rival to God. And Iqbal castigates God very frequently. For Iqbal, Satan is a great hero. And all of this stuff is perfectly acceptable in the literary tradition, and he deploys it. Iqbal sometimes described this apotheosis in terms of man's partnership with God, itself an idea taken from the Babi/Baha'i movement. But the deity was a rival more than a partner, and Iqbal repeatedly imagined man's freedom as being achieved by refusing him in what can be considered the first political act. The first political act is to refuse God, the first act of human freedom. Important about such a refusal, of course, was that it was predicated not upon any conflict over property, but concerned with ideas, and in fact the single most important political idea, that of freedom from external authority. Writing about mankind's inaugural claim to freedom in the story of Adam, Iqbal suggested that, quote, the fall does not mean any moral depravity. It is man's transition from simple consciousness to the first flash of self-consciousness, a kind of waking up from the dream of nature with a throb of personal causality in one's own being. Man's first act of disobedience was also his first act of free choice, and that is why, according to the Quranic narration, Adam's first transgression was forgiven. This tangling with God gave both creature and creator such reality as they possessed. So it made God possible as much as making man possible. And made what Iqbal called the former's ultimate ego, God's ultimate ego, into a model for the latter's freedom. We can only think about human freedom in divine terms, because man's freedom is always modeled on God's freedom. So there is a kind of rivalry there. This was why Iqbal was so set against what he imagined to be the pantheism of monistic Sufism, not because it confused man with God, but rather dissipated the individuality of both and therefore the possibility of conflict between them. What he wants is the rivalry and conflict. He doesn't want man flowing into the divine and losing himself. At the intellectual level, this struggle resulted in a freedom whose social aspect was to be found in politics as a conflict of ideas, rather than in economics as a philosophically indeterminate one over resources. So when you think of politics in economic terms, it's always about resources, who has how much. For Iqbal, that's entirely property-based. What you have to think about competition, rivalry, and enmity and conflict in terms of ideas. Right? That is the only thing that's worthwhile for him. That is the only serious thing. Thus, he ended his book, The Reconstruction, with an English translation of a passage from his most important poetic work, the Javed-Nama of 1932, putting the technical terms of Sufi discourse left unmarked in the Persian original within quotation marks, and so drawing attention to his continuing engagement with them. And I'll read, this is his own translation of his Persian bit of a long epic poem. Art thou in, so it's done in this archaic manner, art thou in the stage of life or death in life? These are all Sufi terms. Invoke the aid of 3 witnesses to verify thy station. The first witness is thine own consciousness. See thyself then with thine own light. The second witness is the consciousness of another ego. See thyself then with the light of an ego other than thee. The third witness is God's consciousness. See thyself then with God's light. If thou standest unshaken in front of this light, consider thyself as living and eternal as he, i.e. as God. That man alone is real who dares to see God face to face. What is ascension? Only a search for a witness who may finally confirm thy reality. A witness whose confirmation alone makes thee eternal. No one can stand unshaken in his presence. And he who can, verily he is pure gold. Art thou a mere particle of dust? Tighten the knot of thy ego and hold fast to thy tiny being. How glorious to burnish one's ego and to test its luster in the presence of the sun. Re-chisel then thine ancient frame and build up a new being. Such a being is a real being, or else thy ego is a mere ring of smoke. So precisely because he was so wedded to the ego and therefore to a dialogical but also competitive and oppositional conception of knowledge, for which no object but only subjects existed in an ethically, philosophically, and indeed politically defined universe, Iqbal could not conceive of any completion or rather perfection in history. In other words, man's rivalry with God, like that of the devil, who was in fact his model in Iqbal's view, had to be eternal and so disallow humanity's final apotheosis. So one of the things that happens when you take time instead of space as your, as it were, nexus of linking the political and the theological, is that you move from a situation where proportion is the defining characteristic. And Iqbal criticizes what he calls Greek dualism, saying it's all about proportionality. And we can see this in modern liberalism, like how much private and versus how much public, how do you balance? It's always a balancing act, it's about proportionality. For Iqbal, this is actually instrumentalist and violent because it's, and entirely spatial. When you take the temporal dimension, it becomes about infinity. Right? Think about the Shiite conception where the Imam's coming is forever deferred. It's infinite. Right? And the space of imperfection which it leaves behind is the space of freedom. Or the Prophet's finality. The Prophet has gone, God is no longer active in history, the future is infinite. The relationship is not that of proportionality. Right? How much belongs to God and how much belongs to man. It's not entirely worked out, but it's a kind of experiment in thinking for him. In other words, man's rivalry with God, like that of the devil, I already read that sentence, and quite apart from saving the honor of traditional Islamic theology in this way, Iqbal returned to what he understood as the Shia conception of salvation's infinite deferral in political life, as a kind of catechon. His poetry is therefore replete with images of incompletion, longing, and unrequited love, whose tragic sensibility might itself have come from a Shia vision of Islam's history as one of loss and imperfection, rather than the Sunni one of victory and accomplishment. Of course, this focus on incompletion is itself another version of Iqbal's idea about the infinite journey of knowledge and life. Gandhi, starting from very different premises, also arrived at a similar conclusion in refusing historical or even personal closure of any kind, while nevertheless firmly holding on to a conception of the perfect as a kind of regulatory ideal, one whose reality was to be found in striving alone. For Iqbal, this kind of tragic incompletion, the Imam never comes. Divine revelation has always ended. It's never now possible again, right? So there's something tragic about it. For Iqbal, this tragic imperfection was not only the sign of man's freedom, but also gave rise to beauty in its very yearning. So he thinks that this is where the aesthetic belongs. It was therefore at the illustration of a purely human and even satanic freedom. The devil is also a tragic figure for Iqbal. Something he rhetorically claimed God could never experience. He says, you know what? There's one thing we have that God doesn't. God might know everything and all the rest. He cannot experience this. Man's freedom might be modeled on God's freedom, but the tragic sense of it, the yearning, that God can never experience. The refusal, that God can never experience. And that is the site of aesthetics. God is not the source of it in some ways, right? The aesthetic dimension is a purely human dimension for Iqbal. And in this way, he made aesthetic experience into a crucial site for man's freedom, one that both mirrored and evoked the still unavailable arena of political freedom defined in exactly by the, it was, of course, in a colonial society that Iqbal was writing, so it is not yet fulfilled freedom. Mirrored and evoked in the still unavailable arena of political freedom defined in exactly the same way, by infinity rather than the economy of subject and object, or public and private, by time rather than space, and incompletion rather than perfection. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faisal. And actually, I should begin by thanking Lina for asking me to moderate this panel. There's nothing better than to feel a part of an institution than to be assigned a job. So I'm really grateful that you assigned me this job. And it was wonderful to hear Faisal's paper. As with all of Faisal's work, one of the fascinating things is that it opens up many, many new questions, particularly in comparative terms, in a provocative and also exceedingly thoughtful way. So as I was listening, because I've been obsessing with the question of history in the past and time, looking at pre-modern as well as modern materials, there are very interesting continuities between pre-modern historians who are dealing with the same issue. They're trained theologically in Islamic terms, and one of the issues for them is why bother write history if the perfect religion already came and we know the Prophet's life, so why tell the stories of human lives? And interestingly, the answer they come up with is somewhat similar to what Iqbal comes up with, that it is the human freedom that exists and that has to be documented and so on. It's a very different type of problem they have than Iqbal has, but I'm just saying this because of the way Faisal has posed the questions opens up fascinating new types of issues. I will stop with that and we open with questions and discussions.
Thank you very much for that amazing and illuminating talk. So I have a couple of questions. I think my central question is to sort of push back a little bit on the distinction between space and time by asking you, first of all, what your thoughts are about certain forms of secularized Christianity that are themselves quite aspirational. I mean, one of the people that I thought of immediately when you were speaking was Feuerbach, and his insistence that in an attempt to kind of secularize Christianity, to say that the divine is really simply the ideal in man. And for him, of course, freedom was a key concept as well. He wasn't concerned in the way that Iqbal is with figuring out the relation between the theological and the political. But I do think that in forms of secularized Christianity, there is something similar to this aspirational, futural, temporal orientation or disposition that you're describing. The second question I have has to do with how the temporal plays out with, across liberal and radical political ideologies in the modern and contemporary era, which is a huge question. But of course, you could also say that there's a kind of secularization of these impulses, both in the radical political tradition, I mean, just to invoke, you know, say Derrida's notion of democracy to come, but also in many of the kind of, you know, aspirational Marxist radical positions. But with it, I would also argue, importantly, within liberalism itself. So, I mean, you use the term regulative ideal, which I thought was like amazing, because that is a key concept within political liberalism. And your focus was essentially on, or Iqbal's focus was essentially, and yours in an admiringly descriptive way, was focused on, you know, a form of economic liberalism, or the power of economic thinking through concepts like interest and property within liberalism. But within political liberalism, you know, beginning with Mill's insistence that you can't really keep the liberal attitude alive unless you're in time hearing arguments from people who don't agree with you, right? So that is profoundly non-spatial, right? And then similarly, you have, you know, really interesting instances of aspirational temporal liberalism, more recently beginning with post-war liberalism, you know, the kind of tragic liberalisms of the post-war, Trilling, Berlin, for example, which are also contemporaneous with existentialism, which is in a way a version of what you're describing. And then even Habermas, the unfinished project of modernity, is similarly aspirational. So I would just sort of, you know, kind of point to that important aspect of liberalism. And then just one tiny last point, which is not so tiny, but you know, it's interesting how individualist the turn is in Iqbal, right, towards attitude, disposition, the individual enactment, which sounds also a little bit like Cavell's perfectionism. And that one could argue that's liberal itself, the individualism. So I'm really curious to hear you think aloud about some of these things.
No, thank you very much. That's great, because I think, you know, you're absolutely right, and in the extended version of the paper I sent to Shahzad, I also do point out that Iqbal is not just unwilling to do a full exit from liberalism. That's not what he's doing. And that's why the use of procedural ideal, what was it, the regulative, the regulative ideal becomes important, both for Gandhi and Iqbal. Because remember, Iqbal doesn't quite found a state, but though Pakistanis might disagree, but Gandhi sort of does. And the state that he lends his authority to is in many ways a liberal state. Yeah, it's not. So both of them have this hankering after another kind of order, but they end up with, intellectually as well as in reality, with some version of a liberal state. Not only in the regulative ideal, but precisely as you point out, in the resistance and the rejection of any telos, which is what characterizes the leftist, communists in particular, politics in this period and subsequently. So that rejection of some perfect world to come and the idea, the figure of the regulative ideal are both, you're exactly right, fundamental to liberal conceptions, and they keep those things. But what Iqbal does is inject it with this kind of tragic sensibility, and which is also an aesthetic sensibility. For him, the problem with that way of thinking is that it's too proceduralist, in the way Habermas and others think about it as well. It's too much about contracts and institutions, and so it is unable to rise up from its own property-obsessed vision of interest, for instance. So both Gandhi and Iqbal are interested in how within putatively liberal order, disinterest becomes possible. How do you actually not just account for it, but invite it, make it possible? Because their fear is that in a fully liberal system, which dominates every aspect of social life, that stuff gets stamped out altogether. The ideal, religion, conviction, spirit, and disinterestedness. But they also understand that no social relations are possible without them. All right? That starting from individuals and families and moving outwards, even the liberal order must presuppose the ability of people willing to sacrifice themselves for ideas and put themselves, not to work merely as interest groups or interested persons in contractual ways. No society can survive without these kinds of things. So they want to figure out how do you actually allow for this to happen within an order whose putatively liberal character they sort of resign themselves to, in a sense, while also trying to think outside it. So I think they're caught in this. It's not an unfamiliar bind. As far as Feuerbach, whose work of course Iqbal knew, Iqbal studied in Heidelberg and Munich, Cambridge, Heidelberg, and Munich, and before the First World War. So he, because one of the reasons why I bring in Strauss here as opposed to Schmidt, for instance, is precisely in order to look at political theology in these Straussian terms, rather than in the Schmittian. But Feuerbach is a kind of predecessor of the secularization thesis of you have what happens in secular society is you have all these theological elements there, but they've been secularized. All right, and so that itself serves as a connection. But what Strauss is interested in, fearfully interested in, and so is Iqbal, is that vision of the secularization thesis. I'm sure they would both accept in some fashion, but they're also interested in how the theological nevertheless survives in its own right as a very powerful force, and not simply in terms of this religion or that religion, but as the force of received authority, whatever you might want to call it. It could be monarchical, it could be anything, but you give it the name theology. And how do you deal with that? And it has to be preserved in some sense, because no political order can survive without received authority in some sense. But how do you refuse to let it dominate and destroy everything else? So one way of doing this, of course, is the liberal way of making these distinctions and separations of powers, and which is another vision, which is in political world what and Iqbal more simplistically describes as public and private distinction. But you can also look at these distinctions within the public realm itself, as in the separation of powers. Right? So because they are so critical of this way of doing things, Strauss and Iqbal, both in their own ways, are interested in the force of what I'm calling the esoteric. I haven't quite worked it out exactly. Now I can see that it's important for Iqbal in making his own radical statements in his poetry. And what esotericism does is it preserves authority while maintaining its freedom from it at the same time. It criticizes it, but it doesn't make for a clash in this manner. And in the same way, he requires God in order for man to exist. Even if man, in a way, even if man's freedom belongs to the secularization thesis, because man's freedom is model on God's freedom, in his view. So, the freedom of man presupposes God. Whether you like it or not, it's like Schmidt, or Feuerbach on Jesus, right? You can't have, you think it's an opposition, but in fact it isn't. So that is part of that section. But how do you actually then continue to maintain that figure, if only to gain even more freedom from him, but in a kind of dialogical or even dialectical fashion? I don't think Iqbal has himself entirely worked this out. He doesn't need to, because he's relying upon a much longer poetic tradition, which he turns, but which allows him to say all of these things. And the way he works esoterically is fascinating. I pointed out in the larger paper how often takes a lot of his ideas, and in his early work he explicitly acknowledges they're coming from Hinduism. They're coming from Baha'ism in particular, but he's very keen on that, interestingly, even though he realizes that they're no longer, they're not Islamic. Right? It doesn't bother him. He likes heresy. He doesn't like the Ahmadis much, but we can discuss that if anyone is interested. And then later on, everything is Islamized. The same ideas are given Islamic genealogies, or something that is given as Sufi genealogy is then attributed to Einstein. So he also thinks about the space-time continuum. He's very keen on, so though I distinguish space and time here, he eventually sees them as operating together this way.
Rachel?
I was really going to go over the tone then after the wonderful talk and the question, and just ask something much more basic. I mean, you talked a lot about the way that his ideas are shaped against Christianity and that very Miltonian fall of man and so on. And also, I mean, we're all very aware of his relationship with Iran. But in passing, you mentioned Gandhi, and one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about Iqbal then is these ideas which just cannot sit comfortably with the idea of the sacred. You can have a secularism, but you're having a more kind of Islamic secularism. How are these ideas going to fit against the majority population of the area in which Iqbal lived? Or do you think in some ways he's not really at all Indian, perhaps, is one of the questions I'd ask you.
Yeah, that's interesting, but that's one reason why he's so ferociously focused on the esoteric, because he's worried, and he does get criticized, including by ulama. So he has fatwas issued against him in his early career that of kufr, that he's not a Muslim and all. It doesn't affect him; he's not in physical danger, but he worries about it because he's not worried about his security. He's worried about his influence and his authority. So he needs to make sure that, as it were, a kind of message is getting through, that he's seen as a Muslim thinker. He's very adamant about that. And what, in a way, he's doing is mobilizing the resources of heresy from within the Islamic tradition and deploying them. And heresy not simply in terms of sort of strange and now invisible sects, but the Sufi tradition itself, which he otherwise ostensibly criticizes severely, but his vocabulary is Sufi from beginning to end, right? It's 100% Sufi, despite the fact that today Iqbal is seen as this kind of serious orthodox type Islamic thinker. So it's a funny position he's in, which is why I bring up Strauss, because that seemed to be, they're both conservative in their own way, but radical in another, and they have to situate themselves. Iqbal often uses the figure of Spinoza to think about this, which is fascinating. Spinoza and the Jews of Amsterdam, how do you, he says the Jews of Amsterdam were entirely correct in repudiating Spinoza's philosophy because they were so finely balanced, given who they were in Amsterdam. They could not do this. And Spinoza also had to be very careful in how he, so he's thinking like Strauss, who also refers to Spinoza over and over again, so there's, so basically it's that worry that that makes esotericism even more important for him personally. But he does feel that because he's mobilizing resources from within a received tradition, he will, and indeed was understood. The problem has been that the radicalism of his vision has been confined to the very aesthetic dimension that he wanted to open up to other realms of life.
I'm curious about whether in the larger modern Islamic world, whether the ideas of Iqbal are discussed and debated outside of small academic circles, but rather within the political world, within ulamas and so forth. Are Iqbal's ideas discussed? Are they debated? Or is he merely an academic exercise?
No, in his own lifetime, he was hugely popular in India and what is today India and Pakistan. I know people would declaim his poems, on the streets, this sort of thing. He was enormously popular. He was knighted for his services and all the rest. But his reputation has only grown subsequently, so he's hugely influential all over the Islamic world today. Now, people read him in very different ways, precisely because of this esoteric dimension, right? So he allows himself to be read in all. So he's considered the spiritual founder of Pakistan. Pakistan is curious because it has 2 founding fathers. I mean, of course, America also has more than one, but most countries only have one. In places like Iran, Khamenei, the supreme leader, is very keen on Iqbal, considers himself an Iqbal scholar, and on a number of occasions gives lengthy, almost interminable speeches about Iqbal. So here you have the top political religious authority in Iran, who knows exactly how to read this stuff because he's trained to do it. So he's been very influential in Iran, in Afghanistan, in everywhere Persian is spoken, but also elsewhere, in Turkey, all over the Muslim world. But there is no, it's like a prism, it's all refracted in different directions. So everyone sort of knows that there's something fairly interesting and perhaps even radical being said here, but it's taken, there is no singular Iqbalian way of thinking. So he's everywhere, but he's dispersed.
So thank you so much for this incredible talk. I feel like I need to study the written text to get the full thing. So forgive me if this question is if you've covered it or if it's a misunderstanding. You started off the talk with you framed it by saying the problem with no separation of church and state is not that it politicizes religion, but that it depoliticizes religion, which I thought was an amazingly insightful idea that I'm going to quote a lot. And so I wanted to ask about this, which is the relationship between esotericism and politics. And I know you touched on it, and I just wanted to hear more about it in 2 different ways. It seems to me that in 2 counterintuitive ways. One is that at this time, the early 20th century, there are a series of figures in different traditions who are, again, counterintuitively linking up esotericism to nationalism. That the discovery or the invention of an esoteric tradition, again, very counterintuitively, turns out to be somehow joins with a nationalist project. And again, as I say, it's counterintuitive, and I was actually wondering how that plays itself out in the kind of context that you're talking about. Again, and the second question is the relationship to elitism. That esotericism, the conventional idea would be that somehow esotericism is connected to elitism, and I think in Strauss, there's certainly an argument to say that that's the case, but that doesn't sound like the case here. And I actually found my mind with the Strauss reference was leading me in one direction, but I felt like that's not what you were saying. That there's a way, and these 2 things are related, the relationship between esotericism and nationalism, the relationship between esotericism and non-elitism. And I want to hear more about that, and I think it also relates to what Amanda was saying as a relationship to liberalism. And I think maybe one of the dividing lines is precisely, well, again, maybe you disagree, but that liberalism, in a way, there's an anti-esotericism to liberalism because of what you were saying. It's all about public discourse and hearing what people have to say and engagement and Habermas and blah, blah, blah. So all that. So that maybe that's part of the dividing line is neither spatial or temporal, institutional or individual, but having something to do with this question of esotericism, which seems crucial, especially in light of the way you framed the talk in the beginning. I hope that was clear.
Yes, no, thank you for that. It's actually quite a difficult problem because you're right, first of all, the Straussian vision has been seen, of course, as elitist, and especially in the way it's been taken up by neoconservatism. With Iqbal, as I tried to suggest, it's a slightly different issue because he can presume that all the people in his society understand what that is. They might not be fitted out to do, highly abstruse and arcane readings, but they all know about the esoteric. And even in popular poetry, people understand that there are levels of reading. And that, the most popular form of Urdu poetry and Persian poetry called the ghazal, which is made up of a set of couplets, each of which can be related or not related to each other. They're related by rhyme scheme, but not necessarily by content, but you could make them related. And everyone realizes that there are at least 3 highly stereotyped ways of reading. Right? Each one admits of different kinds of readings. So Iqbal has the good fortune of assuming a knowledge of the esoteric, which Strauss doesn't. He has to fight, and of course it gets taken into this elitist direction. So with Iqbal, it's actually omnipresent. Of course, it's elitist. You can call it elitist in the sense that there are levels of expertise involved, but also of, there's a kind of legal, this is where the liberal thing comes in again, that you mentioned, that Amanda had brought up. Because very often the esoteric dimension gets reduced to a kind of legalistic and therefore in some ways liberal dimension, because it becomes, but what can you say appropriately? We all do this. People do this all the time. That is acceptable legally, but indicates, dog whistle politics, things like that. It's like that, right? You wouldn't actually go out to say something explicitly, but it's assumed. Or, you write in a guarded fashion. You're writing an email to, I don't know, your dean or something, and you're writing in such a way that you want to suggest. So that's, again, it's entirely commonplace. It's not elitist, but it's a way of thinking about the esoteric which is deprived of these elements, the aesthetic and the spiritual, that Iqbal wants to survive. So the risk is that if you want to even call that esoteric readings, it's both of these kinds of readings are available very generally. The legalistic/liberal one, and even though it's not, or should I put it, necessarily theorized by liberals themselves, and this inherited traditional one, and both of them can go in a elitist direction, but not necessarily. In terms of nationalism, especially in anti-colonial struggles, this of course was crucial. There's a secret knowledge which is not publicly available, which is illicit. Once you have independence, then it becomes fully revealed and then loses something at the same time. So in all of these ways, the esoteric is there. What happens to it is, it can be, the problem with it, I think, is it can be too easily normalized. Because you can just leave it as a legalistic form. Or you can allow people to declaim poetry that has multiple meanings, and that's okay, as long as you're not, shaking, as it were, the system. And that has also that is also something that has happened to Iqbal in contemporary times. So there's the possibility of a great openness, both on religious theological questions and on political ones. But in a way, and I'll stop here with your beginning point, for him it's so important because political life too, though it's meant to be the site of freedom, inevitably becomes a site of authority like theology. It becomes theological in that sense. And the esoteric is crucial because it preserves freedom, as for Strauss. Even a liberal order can become so taken for granted that it just becomes the kind of authority that you work with, and it's good. We all recognize it. But that's not the point. The point is, how do you actually have for yourself and for others a site of freedom, political and intellectual? And that, quite apart from what Strauss, I think, was detained by, it's all about security. The guys feeling they're going to be killed, or, he's always, and I think in a way that's a red herring. For Iqbal, it's not about security. It's about how do you actually preserve a site for free thinking and free acting, one thing leading to another. And that for him is only possible whether or not there's danger involved in the esoteric, because of the the likelihood of the political realm, even without force or compulsion, becoming inevitably naturalized as that of authority, and therefore becoming theological. So the esoteric actually pushes back against the theological, both in its religious form and in its political form, which could include liberalism.
Okay, thank you. We're unfortunately run out of time, so we're going to continue the discussion later into the day. 10-minute break or something? Okay, 5-minute break, and then we are back. Thank you very much, guys.